is a newspaper editor. Newspaper editors have the daily responsibility of deciding which news stories are printed in the paper. Long before the paper is published, the editor assigns reporters to cover the news, checks for accuracy and fairness in the newspaper articles, and writes the headlines as well. Newspaper editors. Newspaper editors reject many more releases than they use. The larger the paper's circulation or the more active the area being covered, the more releases the editor has to sort out through. Most newspapers have a space budget, which is not to be confused with a financial budget. The space budget consists of the total number of pages printed, divided between advertising and news articles. Advertisements are the lifeblood of a newspaper. Ads consistently provide the largest portion of income. The ads must be accommodated first, after which the issue's remaining space is allotted to specific stories and departments by the key editors. The selection of news releases to cover is based on the editor's personal and professional judgment. The main factor is that the judgment can be summed up in a single word: newsworthiness. Unfortunately, newsworthiness is defined by individual editors' opinions. Newsworthy stories are generally those that offer the most information with the most urgency to the most people. If a news release issued on a particular day is not covered in the following day's paper, this does not mean the news will not appear at all. A release is not considered newsworthy enough to appear in a weekday edition may be suitable for the weekend paper, where there is more room and less emphasis on breaking news. Even if a news item is selected for use, the article may get pulled up at the last minute. Perhaps an advertiser cancelled a large insert just prior to deadline, necessitating a layout change, or a big story emerged late in the day. When this happens, more expendable news is sacrificed. What happens to releases that are selected for immediate coverage? Some are kept for future use, but more likely they are sent into the editor's trash can.
Laura Pierce, editor of the Kent Reporter, shares details from her life as a small-town newspaper editor.
I've always liked what Mark Twain said about being a newspaper editor. I am not an editor of a newspaper and shall always try to do right and be good so that God will not make me one. That thought occurred to me several years ago as I was dancing in a Christmas parade, dressed as a giant gift box. I had a bow on my head, and I was blowing a horn. It was pouring down rain, and the battery-operated lights in my box kept going out. Why was I doing this? Because I was the town's newspaper editor, that's why. You do things like this to be part of the community. And okay, I did kind of like the giant bow. Being an editor entails more than just editing. When you're working on a small paper, you're out there with your readers. And that's partly because you don't have security guards to slow some of them down before they find your office. But it's also because you're there, just a few feet off the sidewalk, sitting in the town you cover. It's their town, and you're there on borrowed time. If your door is open long enough, readers will start coming in and asking you to do things. And this is a good thing most of the time. And in my career, these have included, but they're not limited to, the following: organizing a high school dance with an Under the Sea theme. I never thought I'd be buying fishnet by the gross, but there I was at a junkyard with the dance just a few hours away. We managed to scrape the rotting fish scales off in time. Working a 7 a.m. career fair to an audience of 3, one of whom kept mimicking me. Chaperoning a high school class to Hawaii. Okay, no complaints there. Hauling buckets of raw emu guts to a community haunted house. Never again. Taking pictures of a family reunion because they couldn't find a real photographer. Well, I had no idea who anyone was, but I did get a great lunch out of it. And finally, standing on a flatbed truck dressed in outlandish clothing, heaving candy at people. Yes, another parade. But there was a party afterwards, and I didn't have to dance this time. So all right, maybe these things aren't things that Mark Twain would relish about a life in print. But if you think about it, it's been one hell of an adventure. And maybe my extended family seems just a little bigger these days. And I did get first place as a dancing gift box. So take that, Mr. Twain.
Well, let me talk about news editor. The news editor is one of the most important persons who can plan a daily newspaper. His role in any newspaper office, whether it be weekly or daily, is all-pervading. To a national newspaper, an active, intelligent and enterprising news editor is the vital spark which energizes its news coverage and outlook. He is responsible for a steady and continuous inflow of up-to-the-minute news into newspaper office. Although most of the news supplied is a mechanical process covered by daily routine, but all machinery of news gathering, the news editor is responsible for watching its smooth functioning. The news editor keeps a careful eye on the routine side of his news collection as well as the other side of his work, or the news desk, which calls for more imaginative emulation. Some of the functions of the news editors are: an ideal news editor manages to get all the obvious stories into his paper with a good proportion of them as exclusives. The number of words received on the teleprinter in a newspaper is so large that if each word were to be printed, the newspaper will run into hundreds of pages each morning. The news editor is called upon to use his discretion, discrimination, and imagination in reading the public mind and select the stories which have real news values and can be called important by the readers. There are some fundamental stories which no newspaper can afford to miss as they go into all the daily newspapers without exception. While they are important and have to be included, there are others called exclusives, which only an alert news editor can discover from the huge and large ocean of copy that has been pouring into his office during the day. An intelligent news editor has to make a judicious follow-up seemingly promising paragraph, or sometimes even make further inquiry before finalizing the story and give it a perfect shape he wants. The news editor gets good satisfaction from the stories which are exclusive to his own newspaper. If he can manage to get into every issue a dozen or more minor stories with good news value but exclusive, he feels elated. The news editor is also responsible for final security of important news stories submitted by different correspondents, feature writers and outside correspondents as well. Any slip on his part can land the newspaper into trouble, hence good newspapers have highly experienced and intelligent news editors. The hurry and scurry of daily routine makes heavy demands upon the organizing ability of the news editor and his decisions, especially when time is short, yet there has to be accuracy. There are certain qualities that news editor must possess. He must have an infinite amount of patience and a keen interest in news of all kinds. He must have a good general educational background with a fair amount of historical, political and economic knowledge. He must enjoy reading the newspapers, the weeklies and the magazines. He must not think that he can keep normal working hours, for it is true of the news editor that anybody else that he is always on duty, whether at home or in the office. Some of the daily routines of news editor are as: his working day begins early. Once he gets to his office, there is so much to be one that he has little time to examine thoroughly his own paper and those of rival managements. Therefore, he must begin his reading with his early morning cup of tea and continue it on the way, so that when he gets to his desk, he has a fair idea of the contents of the morning newspapers. His assistant will have arrived earlier and will have prepared a list of his papers, exclusive news items and more depressing list that of the stories which the paper has missed. He must also allot men to the news stories which have cropped up and to inquiries which may not produce immediate results, but which may be the preliminary step towards a first-class article a few days later. But he must watch his manpower closely. He must not fritter it away, and he must not be left in the position that if later in the morning big news comes in, the reporter's room is empty. Assuming that the morning is a norms one, the newspaper editor, having allotted the new reporters their assignment, turns his attention to a judicious follow of seemingly promising paragraph, or sometimes even make further inquiry before finalizing the story and give it a perfect shape he wants. The news editor gets good satisfaction from the stories which are exclusive to his own newspaper. If he can manage to get into every issue a dozen or more minor stories with good news value but exclusive, he feels elated. The news editor is also responsible for final security of important news stories submitted by different correspondents, feature writers and outside correspondents as well. Any slip on his part can land the newspaper into trouble, hence good newspapers have highly experienced. What does editors actually do? Just as the military has a chain of command, newspapers have a hierarchy of editors responsible for various aspects of the operation. The graphic shows a typical hierarchy starting at the top with the publisher. The publisher is the top boss, the person overseeing all aspects of the paper on both the editorial side of the things as well as the business side. However, he or she often has little involvement in the day-to-day operations of the newsroom. Then comes the editor-in-chief. He does all the paperwork, hiring, budgets, etc. The editor's involvement with the day-to-day running of the newspaper varies with the size of the paper. On small papers, the editor is very involved. On big papers, maybe less so. Then comes the managing editor. The managing editor is the one who directly oversees day-to-day operations of the newsroom. More than anyone else, perhaps, he or she is the one responsible for getting the paper out every day and for ensuring that it's the best that it can be. Again, depending on the size of the paper, the managing editor may have a number of assistant managing editors responsible for the specific sections of the paper, such as news, sports, etc. Then comes the assignment editors. Assignment editors are those directly responsible for specific section of the paper, such as news, business, sports, features, etc. They are the editors who deal directly with the reports. They assign stories, work with reporters on their coverage, suggest angles and leads, and do the initial editing of reporters' articles. Then the last comes copy editors. Copy editors typically get reporters' stories after they have been given an initial edit by assignment editors. They edit stories and often also write headlines and do the layout. Assignment editors do what is called macro editing. This means that as they edit, they tend to focus on the content, the big picture aspect of the story. Here's a checklist of things assignment editors look for when they are editing. The first one is the lead, which means, does it make sense? Is it supported by the rest of the story? Is it in the first paragraph or is it buried? Then comes the story, which says, is it thorough and complete? Are there any unanswered questions? Is it fair, balanced and objective? Then comes the libel. That means, are there any statements that might be considered libelous? Then comes writing, which says, is the story well written? Is it clear and understandable? Did the reporter double check all names, titles and places mentioned in the story? Did the reporter properly check all the phone numbers or web addresses? Are the quotes accurate and properly attributed? Are the story's background and context complete enough to tell the readers why the story is relevant? Copy editors tend to do what is called micro-editing. This means that as they edit, they tend to focus on more technical aspects of stories, such as Associated Press style, that's called AP style, grammar, etc. Here's a checklist of things assignment editors look for when they are editing. First up, is the story's Associated Press style correct? Have all errors in grammar and punctuation been fixed? Are there any misspelled words? Of course, these divisions are not hard and fast rules. Assignment editors can certainly check for AP style and spelling errors, while copy editors certainly keep an eye out for the things like libel.